Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Kyte. I'm a professor of practice and climate policy here, and I'm also the UK's Special Representative on climate. And it is my distinct privilege and an honour to welcome Todd Stern to the University of Oxford, to Blavatnik School of Government. I've known Todd personally and professionally for a number of years, but Todd served from 2009 to 2016 as the Department of State's climate envoy, and therefore the chief negotiator in the Obama administration on climate. And he has written, finally, can I say finally?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a wonderful book, Landing the Paris Climate Agreement. And we are about 10 days away from negotiators arriving in Baku for the 29th edition of the climate talks. There are people in this room who've been to different COPs over the years, and then some of you studying what this means and looking to the future. So it's a great time to read the book as multilateralism is pulled at the edges from different directions, and climate perhaps has been one of the areas where multilateralism is still alive and well in whatever form. So, Todd, welcome. I'm going to ask 2 or 3, hopefully, soft lob questions, and then some really difficult questions are going to come from the audience. And submit them. I've got a device here that will show me the ones that are submitted electronically, and then we'll take hands in the room. So it's a great read because it's a sort of first-hand account, but also a first-hand analysis of what it took to get to the Paris Agreement. And we're 9 years out, right? Next year will be 10 years. Yeah. The world today is not the world that we were in 2015.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the year running up to Paris, because you go back to the sort of the run-up to Paris, which goes over many years. But what was the world like that year?
Well, so the book looks at the 7-year road really to the Paris Agreement, and not just because of the fact that that was the year that Obama started and that I started with him, but there was a negotiation going on that started the year before, trying to get still the second or third time to try to negotiate the kind of operational meat on the bones agreement that needed to happen after the original framework agreement was done all the way back in 1992. So there have been a lot of failures up until then. I think in actually when you get to, and I'm happy to talk about all the time before, there was some fascinating and chaotic times before that, but in the year of Paris itself, I think that there had been a very big event that occurred in 2014, which was would turn out to be a secret negotiation. We came up with an idea. John Kerry was the Secretary of State then, and he had come the year before and very charged up about working with China. I had been working with the Chinese closely all the way back to 2009, but Kerry wanted to do big things with China. He wanted to, he started a US-China climate change working group, and he went there and got a big, strong statement on climate change and all of that. And then Obama also met Xi Jinping for the first time, because that's when Xi Jinping came in. And they met in a place called Sunnylands in California, and it was not designed to be the kind of meeting that was supposed to spit out deliverables, which is the government word for things happening, concrete, statements, whatever. But there was one single area actually produced something of note, and that was climate change on a relatively small matter, but not such a small matter of a particular pollutant that we had come up with a creative way to deal with this outside of the climate negotiation, because it was a chemical that was originally produced to help save the ozone layer. So it was able. So we got it. We understood that in order to get this done, we would have to go into a different treaty body for reasons that I can talk about later. I don't want to take time now, but that got done. So in essence, good things had happened in 2013. So Kerry called me into his office in January 2014 and basically said, what are we going to do for an encore? So I said, give me a day. I'll talk to my team. We'll come up with an idea. So the idea we came up with, it's actually my chief of staff at the time, had the inspiration to what if our two presidents, who we knew were going to meet together in November of 2014, because there was a meeting of a group called APEC that was going to be in Beijing, and what if the two of them would announce their targets for Paris, which at that point would be 1 year away, and sort of galvanize the international effort. And my initial reaction was, that's a good idea, but that'll never happen, because the Chinese don't want to make their allies, India, South Africa, Brazil, and any number of others, would all get mad at them. But I don't think I had much finished the sentence before I started thinking, except there's a way that they might want to do it. And the way that I thought that they might want to do it was not about climate so much, but about the larger relationship. And Xi Jinping had a sort of buzz phrase that he was using a lot at that time, which was, we need to have a new kind of great power relations, which basically meant U.S. don't get in our way when we're rising. but that's what he was hoping that there could be, that the U.S. would kind of buy into that. So my guess is that's why they said yes in the end. But anyway, they did say yes. There was this sort of fascinating 10-month secret negotiation, which had to be secret because we couldn't actually go through with it until we saw what the Chinese number was going to be. Mm-hmm. And the same with them. I mean, we had to, but what from our point of view, we couldn't send President Obama down the aisle with Xi Jinping and effectively giving him a big hug and then have the Chinese lay an egg in terms of what they were actually doing. So we had to keep it secret. I had to explain that several times to Secretary Kerry, who wanted to, when I went over there with him in February to discuss the idea with the Chinese, starting with Xi Jinping. And Kerry was gung-ho for a big press release because, he was a politician and politicians like press releases. But so I managed to convince him to do a small press release that wouldn't give away the secret. And then we were off. But it was it had a huge impact on the mood of the entire world, to go back to your original question, at the beginning of 2015, because countries saw the U.S. and China as correctly as a sort of two 800-pound gorillas who had always been, at loggerheads in one way or another, and that if this could happen, not just that they announced that the targets were announced, but that there was a relatively short agreement, like actual written agreement, but 2 or 3 pages, but very consequential, that said things like, we really want to get this done. We're going to work together. If there are any obstacles that come up along the way, we're going to work together to solve these, any problems, and various other things. So that then led countries all over the world to think, and I think they already felt this was the 4th year. We're coming up to the 4th year of a 4-year negotiation. And there had been a lot of failure in the past. In one way or another, countries had been trying to do this thing since 1995. That's when the effort first started. So it's not that they were pessimistic before, but everybody had been burned a lot, and the notion that this could still fall apart, and if it fell apart, have it's sort of an enormously bad impact on multilateralism per se. And then suddenly seeing Obama and Xi literally walking down the aisle together with the red carpet in the Great Hall of the People, not quite arm in arm, but almost. So it just, and I talked to, in the course of the year, there were all sorts of meetings and stuff, and over and over again, I would have sometimes countries who were always butting heads with the U.S. come up and say, when you did that with China, we believe this is going to get done now.
So the relationship between the US and China is different today. Yeah. And the book is full of anecdotes and stories about your relationship with Xi Jinping,
Yeah.
your counterpart,
Yeah.
who is a storied climate diplomat in his own right. So, could that happen? Can that kind of diplomacy happen even when at the top it's so fractious?
It's harder. I mean, it was the thing you have to remember, or one thing you have to remember is it wasn't like great before. There used to be a once-a-year meeting called the Strategic and Economic Dialogue that would meet at the presidential and ministerial level. The fact that it doesn't exist now is another illustration of the difference for sure. But the tendency to the belief that we could do something on climate change then didn't happen just because everything was good. I mean, I'm just thinking back to a prep session for the SNED one year when we had to go to Kerry's house because he hurt himself skiing or on a bike or something. So, and there were probably 9 or 10 of us each talking about their own issue, and I went last, and everybody's issue was like completely difficult. You know, making no progress, economics, South China Sea, the Dalai Lama. I mean, you name it. There were all kinds of problems, and it was never easy with the Chinese on climate change, but it was different. Interestingly, the first time I met Xia in March of 2009, I said to him, I think that you and I should try to make this a positive element or pillar in our relationship, and I think we can do that. And that was certainly not the case before on climate change either. And it didn't sort of automatically happen quickly, and it was actually very difficult all during 2009 in terms of making actual progress. The relationship itself was good from the start and has always been good. I think it's a lot harder now because of the level of tension and strain that exists, and the level of, I think, pretty fundamental distrust on both sides. And that's a really hard thing to get over. And again, it's not like, you know, Obama and Hu Jintao or you know, previous presidents were buddies, but the level, I mean, it's a level of distrust that gets to both countries thinking about whether there's going to be war over Taiwan. I mean, it's like very serious. So at the same time, I think Kerry, Kerry, who was the special envoy in the Biden administration, and now John Podesta, who took his place, I think have both prioritized the notion of trying to interact with the Chinese climate change people on the basis that we need to work together, we can work together. It's a good thing for us to be able to work together on something that can actually make progress. But so I think the answer is that we can in principle, but it's all sort of depends on compared to what, like just how bad is it? Like if there's an actual war, no, we won't be, won't be. But how, and you have now, I think the fact that, you know, putting aside Taiwan, the fact that China has come in as a really active supporter of Russia's war on Ukraine is a hugely aggravating fact. The fact that the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans and the Iranians seem to be forming some kind of something is the sort of thing that creates all the wrong vibes, certainly in the national security side of the administration. But so, you know, John Podesta was in China just a few weeks ago trying to work out an understanding that would help get us through the current COP that's coming up. There's a big climate meeting every year, conference. It's called the Conference of the Conference of the Parties, therefore it's called the COP number whatever, and this year it's number 29. And they're talking, I think, in a very constructive way to see how, you know, we both see things a little differently. How can we find some way that works together? So yes, but.
Yeah. So through when I was reading the book, I thought, well, this is the book written by a man who was negotiating for a big power.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, and obviously the relationship between China and the US was fundamental.
Yeah.
And that you tell that story really well in the book, and I think it's worth looking at for that reason alone.
It's even funny in places.
It's even funny in places. But the Paris Agreement was famously also about how small states leveraged themselves to the hilt in the negotiations. Talk a little bit about how as a big state you react when, the Marshall Islands or whoever come in and really lead.
It was really one of the most fascinating things in the years leading up to Paris and at Paris itself. The vulnerable countries they punch above their weight, particularly if they're savvy. They sort of all do to some extent because they live on the edge of existential ruin. And that's true for the small islands who could actually see their islands go under. But it's true for poor countries all over the world who are much more have much more at risk in terms of climate impacts than that they cause much of the emissions, which they don't. So they always have that kind of a characteristic, and they were already playing significantly all the way back in Copenhagen. I mean, not so much in the broad strokes of what was going on, but they were, I won't go into the whole Copenhagen discussion, which would take a long time. But at the very end, there was a relatively small group of leaders who were hacking out with the Danes, a thing that came to be called the Copenhagen Accord, and the developing countries were very keen already then to get some kind of reference in having to do with the temperature limit that was embedded in that document. And so when you think about the action taken on or to be taken on climate change, there are always two kinds of goals that are in mind. One is emissions. How do you get eventually to zero or net zero, and then the temperature rise? So they're completely interrelated, but there's always sort of those two. And back in Copenhagen was the first time there was a recognition of 2 degrees holding the limit of the rise in global average temperature at 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. So that was that first made its way into a climate document then, but the small and particularly island states were already knew that wasn't good enough. And so they were very keen to have some kind of reference. And the Chinese just said no. I mean, till the last minute. The Chinese. So again, imagine it was a very extraordinary meeting of 25 leaders. Never had come before. The Danes took the crazy risky, admirably risky, but kind of crazy move to invite leaders. Really crazy when you're not sure you're going to have something when they get there. And in fact, we didn't have anything when they got there. Right. So then, there was this last sort of 24, 30 hours that something got put together. But the very, very last issue was this plea from Nasheed from Maldives was there, and many others. And in the room were all these leaders. The Chinese, and there were a few countries that sent their minister. The Chinese sent a lower level person, which irritated everybody in the room, irritated the Brazilians, irritated everybody. And they held out to the last minute. Finally, they caved in on a very convoluted phrase. But the convoluted phrase still had 1.5 in there, and that led to what happened down the road, which ultimately it became the goal, which we are probably not going to meet, but at least it's the right goal at least.
So I'm going to open it up for questions, but just a couple of things on my mind. So if we tell the story of Paris, then the US relationship with China was fundamental, but it was also you and your team that sowed the idea of a nationally determined contribution, this sort of bottom-up way of doing things. And you also put some poison pills in there to Trump-proof. You didn't know Trump would be elected, but the difficulties of the US Senate and the partisan nature of the climate debate in the US. Talk a little bit about those things, because I think, if we were writing the obituary, right, of the Paris Agreement or of, God forbid, you and your team, these were fundamentally new innovations, right?
Yes.
Or were they?
Yeah, no, they were. I just wanted, I didn't fully finish the answer, the question. It didn't fully answer the question that I was almost there, but I didn't quite finish it on how the small countries were dealt with. And so, yes, the small countries got engaged and all the way back to Copenhagen, but it was also really important that they ended up being led by a guy, Tony de Broom from the Marshall Islands, who was a strategist. Yeah. It wasn't just, we're poor, we're suffering, we might disappear, you've got to do something for us, and then here's the 9 things which seem impossible for the bigger countries to do. I mean, Tony was really smart and worked with us a lot in the formulation of the things that they wanted going to Paris, and all during that year. I spent a lot of time with him, as did others on our team, and all the way to the end. And I think it was in maybe the end of the first week that he and I were talking, and I think he used the term high ambition coalition for the first time in a private meeting. And I said, that's good. I'm going off to do a press conference in an hour. Can I use that? He said, yeah, use it. And so I put it out there. And I said, there is in fact a high ambition coalition developing. The U.S. is part of it, which had never been, the U.S. had always been a little bit on the outside of the sort of work that the UK and the EU had pioneered with the smaller countries, but we were very much in it then. And Tony used to say it's a coalition of big and small, rich and poor, and he wasn't going to lay down and if it's not legally binding in every way, you can't be part of it. He wasn't laying certain demands down which would have put us on the outside or put somebody else on the outside. He wanted a powerful coalition that had clout and could get the key parts of what he used to call the ambition mechanism into the Paris Agreement. So he did that, and we were over 100 countries. My friend Shia was bitterly sarcastic about it every time I talked to him, and he didn't like it at all. Brazil, actually, with our friend Isabella Teixeira, who was very progressive in Brazil, sort of took Brazil from the 4-country China, India, South Africa, Brazil group. They were still sort of nominally there, but she entered Brazil into the High Ambition Coalition, which was shocking, but really important. So yes, there were many countries that were not the big guys who had power, and the way you have power is if you build the right coalition. And that's just the way things work.
So I remember standing in so you can imagine this just cavernous, goes on for miles and miles and miles, conference center out at the old airport in Paris. And I remember, so each of the countries had an office, right, or a pavilion. Right. That's the word. And they were made with sort of with MDF or plywood or something. And I remember the Brazilians announced that they were joining the High Ambition Coalition, or it emerged into the ether that they were, and there were a bunch of people sort of standing outside of the pavilion, and Isabella came marching out to go to some working group meeting, and everybody just spontaneously applauded. I mean, there were these little moments, right? Yeah. But talk about the NDCs, this idea of bottom up.
Yeah, and you can never forget the potential importance of one person.
Yes.
Because Isabella doesn't do that. If Isabella's not at that COP,
it wouldn't
they're
have
not
happened.
in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And if Jairam Ramesh, all the way back in 2009 and 10, was not there for India, we would not have gotten the Copenhagen Accord done.
Yeah.
No way. So it's not that I mean, everybody works under the the umbrella of what their country interests are, and they've got to sort of stick with that. But individuals matter. Okay, so so the NDCs and such.
Yeah, I mean, nobody had thought about that originally, right? Bottom up.
I sort of think yes and no, because if you go all the way back to the agreement that was negotiated in 1997, countries there, which only developed countries didn't have any obligations at that point, but they were negotiating with each other, what their target was. So it was the US, the EU, I guess the UK was in the EU at that point, Japan and Australia and others were in a room negotiating, like we're going to do this, that's not enough, and blah, blah, blah. So in Copenhagen, it was essentially, it wasn't spelled out like that, but countries were both developed countries and developing countries who were willing to do it. But before we agreed to that language, we already knew who they were, because we had essentially a G20 kind of organization that we started, and we met all year long. So we knew that China and India and these others were putting things forward. So it didn't say bottom up there. It didn't say nationally determined per se, but they actually were that. So that was already a kind of a model. And there are two aspects of Paris that were quite essential. And one was that it's a mix of bottom up and top down. So bottom up, countries can decide for themselves, and most importantly, on what your target's going to be, what your so-called NDC, nationally determined contribution, but that basically is just fancy words to mean target. So that was crucial, and they were also bottom down, like the bottom down requirements. So the bottom up were both bottom up and not legally binding, and the top down were both top down and legally binding. So what we created essentially, and this was very much the U.S., we created a hybrid legal animal. And the reason is because we operate under a provision, the likes of which no other country has to deal with, which is Article 2, Section 2 of our Constitution, which says that for international treaties, the president has to have the advice and consent of the Senate, and by 2/3. And there are, like, what is and is not the kind of international agreement that requires that is a fine art, and one of the great State Department legal minds was on our team, and we knew what we could agree to as legally binding without going over the line to trigger that provision, and what we couldn't. And people had seen the U.S. agree to something, Kyoto, and then not be able to join it for exactly that reason, because Kyoto absolutely was the kind of agreement, no questions asked, had to go to the Senate. There was not a chance in hell that was going to happen. We couldn't possibly get 2/3. We would have been lucky to get 20 votes at that time. So we had to have, when I started, I came in with one absolute conviction, that we would not agree to something that we could not join. Because it's pointless. It's bad for the world. It's bad for the U.S. So there were these kind of interesting elements of the Paris Agreement that were different from anything that had come before.
So I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to go to the audience now. And there's a great question here a very timely question here from Brendan Devlin. So does the COP summitry approach need reform?
Does it COP what approach?
Summitry.
Summitry approach.
Or are we prioritizing new announcements over effective implementation of what already exists? How can the COP process be complemented with other strategies, such as we are seeing with numerous other announcements, for example, the methane pledge or methane, energy efficiency, tripling renewables? Oh, somebody's been reading the UAE results. So, so have we arrived at peak COP?
So I think you have to have the COP, but I don't think you have to have only the COP, right? So I think if you look at what's coming up this year, that's actually super important. This year, meaning this coming year, 2025, is the next time for countries to have to ratchet up their pledges. And there were sort of two staggered 5-year cycles that were at the heart of the mitigation part of Paris, and one of them is countries had to put forward their targets, and each 5 years they had to ratchet them up, and they were supposed, and the ratchet up had to be up. They had to be better than what was before, and indeed they were supposed to be to their highest level of ambition, I think is the phrase from Paris. So none of that is legally binding, but it's sort of like soft law. It is a kind of a crucial part of the agreement. So I've lost where you're.
Well, so you said the
Oh,
question is about whether we need, whether we've gone beyond COPs.
So you need you do need to have this COP process work. It will be, I think, exceptionally disappointing to the world and to the COP itself if at the end of the process of new targets coming in, which are supposed to come in as early as February. I think in some cases like the EU, that's almost certainly going to be a little bit beyond that. But these targets are supposed to go out to 2035, so basically for the period 2025 to 2035. If you now process also the fact that the key goals that have been either in the Paris Agreement or have sort of strengthened since that time, temperature and emissions, they both talk about 2050 or mid-century. So when you're at 2035, you're 15 years away. If what we do between now and then is weak, we're never going to get to those goals, and that would be a kind of very bad admission for the COP. So, and I think it would be damaging to the process. And again, the big process is the process that lets small countries all over the world participate. And there are, any number of features having to do with transparency, our countries doing what they said they're going to do, and all of that. So I think you have to have it, but I think you don't have to have only it. And if you have things like the methane agreement, if countries actually follow through with it, that'd be really important. I think that we started. I mentioned this a minute ago. A sort of G20-ish entity called Major Economies Forum. So think 17 of the biggest developed and developing countries. And in my book, I actually have a little bit in there where I say we should expand it to be the same countries as the G20. So it's actually, we include everybody. And it should now be not how do we put together the language for a new agreement, but how do we decarbonize in time? And it should happen at the leader level, I think, every year, and get prepared by a couple of meetings, at the ministerial level before that, and led off by like a world-class climate scientist who also has world-class capacity to talk to non-scientists to start every meeting, because I think the notion that leaders actually really get it, get it, I don't believe in many, many cases. So I think that kind of thing would be important. And I think other agreements, if there are agreements between some set of the important countries on making green steel or on this, that, or the other thing, anything that can move the process forward, I think makes sense. So I don't think it should be only the COP, but I don't think you can get rid of it without a lot of damage.
Yeah. And then, okay, so 1, 2, and 3.
To follow on literally to that question. About 4 years ago, we published a report. There we go. Thank you much. Benito Müller, ECI here. 4 years ago, we published a report called Quo Vadis COP, which was meant to look at the whole process. We're updating that now, and I've come to a conclusion which will shock you.
Okay.
Basically, let's talk about not the trade show and the summits, but the actual sessions of the governing and subsidiary bodies, the negotiations. Mm-hmm. We don't need negotiations. We still need the sessions, but instead of just producing paper and decisions and consensus, what else could these sessions do to actually help to come to high ambition? Mm-hmm. Right? We need more beef than paper. How about that?
Maybe pass.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Omnia. I'm from Egypt, and I worked previously with the COP27 presidency.
Yeah.
So my question is...
You look familiar, that's why, right? Yeah, I thought so, yeah.
Yeah. My question is around the NDCs, and do you think the NDCs can help particularly developing countries access the funding that they need? And is there a way right now that we can work with our countries to develop more ambitious NDCs in the lead up to the February deadline? And how can we translate the NDCs from just UNFCCC submission to actual implementation?
Mm-hmm.
So let me talk to your question first. I think that if developing countries were to work on with whatever assistance is useful on concrete plans to build resilience, to build toward a green economy like that, and can quantify ways in which international assistance would help that, I think that would give you a better chance to get what is always going to be an international availability of money, even in a world where there's been a revolutionary change in the amount and the way that the money is put forward. It would still be a good thing for countries to say, not just we want money, but we want to do this. We have this much money that we can put in ourselves. But to get over the hurdle of what we need to do this thing, which will help us in resilience, it'll help us in building green, then can we get it? Then I think that would be useful. I think that it is going to be really important, and Rachel is the expert on this. But the money that we're talking about can't just be looked at in the context of, there's $100 billion a year pledged by the developing countries back in Copenhagen, and that comes sort of through the UNFCCC, window, if you will. The bigger sources of capital, and that's got to continue. And what the new number is going to be, that's more than 100, but is not going to be gargantuan, is part of what is sort of the biggest focus of the COP this year in Azerbaijan. But the much bigger potential funding available is going to come from fundamentally reforming and changing the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, the way the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, works, and to plug in with big development, country development banks, such as the Brazilians have a huge one. So I would hope that, and all of that's got to take place outside of the UNFCCC. It can be reported in to say, here's what we've done. But the place where there's been really good progress made in the last several years is the G20. And I would recommend to anybody interested in this particular subject to look at the triple agenda that was put out under the Indian leadership at the G20 last year. prepared by one of their top economists, N.K. Singh, and one of the U.S. top economists, Larry Summers. And it's very clear, it's easy to read, it's very detailed about the kinds of things that could be done and the kind of fundamental culture change that has to happen in these organizations. But I think yes to your question, as long as it is kind of concrete, not just we can't promise anything unless we know what you're going to give us. Think about what you can do, and then think about what funding is needed, and think about how you can contribute to the part of the funding. I think that gives countries a better chance to have things work out.
So we've got a bunch of people.
Do you want me to respond to Benito?
Yes, and then
yeah. Ideas.
Well, you can have my ideas in time. I mean, look, I don't think that we shouldn't be negotiating things for the sake of having a negotiation. That's for sure. I don't think that's actually happening. There continue to be elements of the Paris Agreement that were articles that were agreed to that aren't quite finalized yet. So that takes up some of the conversation. There are these 2 5-year cycles, and the fact that there are these staggered 5-year cycles. The other one is the global stock take. The first one of those was in Dubai last year in 2023. Remarkably, it has some very important language in there. The single most important half sentence talks about transition, the imperative of transitioning away from fossil fuels in a manner consistent with reaching our 2050 goals. That's a very extraordinary, radical thing to have managed to find its way into the final document. I suspect that the fossil fuel world, including countries, first of all, but also companies, will find some ways that they mean to wiggle out of that, because that would be incredibly important. That's the biggest impediment to our doing fossil fuel power, are doing what we need to do. But so I think that the COP needs to come together. I think it's a good thing to come together, particularly now there's the habit of leaders coming and having the focus of a country's press being their leader going to the COP, a place where things can be discussed having to do with how dire the situation is or what needs to be done. But I'm certainly not against concrete things happening there. I think, but the concrete things also are probably going to happen outside of there altogether.
I mean, I think it's interesting this year that the Brazilians innovated the G20 to have this TF Clima, right? So to bring finance ministers together with environment ministers and climate ministers. So, finance ministers have talked about climate in their own world. Obviously, environment and climate ministers have driven the climate discussion, but bringing the two together. And when you listen to Anatoni, who is the envoy for Brazil, who has said this publicly as well as in smaller sessions, that it was remarkable that within G20 countries, often the officials and the ministers, were kind of talking to each other in the context of a G20 in the way that they weren't talking to each other at home, right? And so these are worlds that have to come together.
No, I mean, I think that was an extraordinarily important thing to happen, because environment ministers want the money, but they don't know anything about finance. And the finance ministers know all about finance, but they don't have passion on climate change. So yanking these two things together is really important.
So I think the hope is that the South Africans will continue that process. So there was, yes, in the grey jumper, excellent. In the black jumper at the back, and then I think in the maroon jumper. So if you could ask questions quickly, and we'll try and keep notes here.
What time are we at? Do we know it?
We've got 15 minutes.
Okay, good.
So quick fire.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a question about the specificity of the temperature target and the enshrined balance between emission sources and sinks within the Paris Agreement, how they are read in conjunction nowadays. There's an emerging discourse how that legitimizes overshoot scenarios, because the target infrastructure is kept quite flexible through this net zero component. And I would love to hear from you whether, through sort of a historic reflection, how this flexibility was maybe necessary in the negotiations, essentially having a target that is so flexible, and then maybe a future projection where you see risks relating to overshoot scenarios being legitimized through the regulatory architecture of the Paris Agreement.
And when you say keeping the targets flexible, you just say again what?
Oh yeah. Okay. So we have the temperature target on the one hand side,
Yeah.
but then we also have this balance of sources and sinks
Yeah.
enshrined in the Paris Agreement, and that theoretically allows for overshoot scenarios, at least. That has been currently debated in literature, and it wouldn't necessarily be in breach with Paris Agreement, so at least some people argue that. And maybe you could give us a bit of a historic reflection whether this balance of sources and things was necessary for people to agree to the temperature target in the first place, but there's this criticism that it actually makes the rigidity or the specificity of the target quite flexible and takes away the robustness of the temperature target and legitimizes overshoot.
Very good. While you're thinking about the answer to that, at the back, thank you.
What do you think happens to U.S. climate, like U.S. international climate policy in a potential Trump administration? And like, who are the specific people or departments or teams that would be most impactful in defining that?
Okay, I was playing bingo. And I was like, when will somebody ask that question? That's well done. You won. You win. Sorry. There you go.
So I think
Maybe should I do those two? And
Okay, do those two, and then we'll come. Is that okay? Yeah, Bear with us. Thank you.
I know I have to listen carefully. I don't want to. I want to have all of my attention.
Before we get to the lawyer.
So on the first question, the balance of sources and sinks, I actually think is a little bit different from the temperature goal. The balance, right? I mean, the temperature goal is directly related to people talking about, well, we can get to 1.5 with overshoot, or we can get to 2 with overshoot. What that basically means is you go up above what the target should be, in the hopes that you're able to reduce enough that you'll actually have negative emissions. Like, so you imagine a period where there's really no new emissions coming out, but sinks are the forests and plants and everything in the world that sucks up CO2. So I don't think that the fact of talking about sources and sinks indicates any looseness in what the targets would be. Overshoot absolutely does that. And I don't think anybody is talking about overshoot because overshoot was negotiated as far as Paris. They're talking about overshoot because they're looking and they can't see how we can not overshoot. And so overshoot, at least the theory is, and I don't know if this really holds up. I think the theory on the part of people who focus on this is that it makes you feel better to think that even though you go up above what the target should be, you're going to be able to bring it back, and not just feel better, but it will make the situation less dangerous. It's also true, though, that you can't get overly excited about how much good overshoots are going to do, because if you've overshot for the next 20 years, and the overshoot is what triggers this or that tipping point event, they're not going to do you any damn good, right? So because once the Amazon turns into a savanna, it doesn't really help that you've brought it back to the temperature back down.
The November the 5th
Trump,
question.
yes. So somebody said earlier, I don't know if it was you or I don't think somebody said we're 10 days away. Maybe was it? Did you say that at the beginning? We're 10 days away from the COP starting, but we are. What is today now? Today is
six
the
days away.
30th. Yes. So we're 6 days away from knowing if the mood in the COP is going to be relieved or desolate, because the U.S. election is November 5th. My guess is it'll take. Well, if Trump just wins straight up, there's more. He gets over 270 electoral votes, which is the way the ridiculous U.S. system works. then it'll be over. If Harris appears to have won, then you're just going to have a bloodbath. Not literally a bloodbath. Well, I hope not literally a bloodbath, but you'll have a mess of litigation where Trump tries again to overthrow the election. With respect to your question, though, look, internationally, there is an office within the State Department that is sort of the permanent climate office. The U.S. has a system in general with respect to our agencies where lots more new people come in every time there's a new election. It's still by far the largest numbers are permanent people. Lots more in the U.S. come in than in other countries, but you're still going to have this office. And what happened in 2017 was that office, which had a number of people who used to be on my team when I was negotiating, they still continued to show up at the COPs, and they were remarkably actually useful in some ways. That what was going on right around then was what came to be called the Paris Rule Book. So you need to negotiate often more detailed guidelines than the 2 pages that the agreement includes for transparency or other issues. But transparency is a good one to focus on, both because it's one of the most important issues that was part of that rule book, and also because the 2 facilitators, negotiators who had been chosen to kind of be the team that was going to work on sort of leading the overall negotiations, were one Chinese and one American. And after Trump elected, they just kept doing it all the way through to getting the thing done. Mm-hmm. So, but I don't think that there's another part. There's not going to be any interest in the White House, and there's not going to be any interest, I think, in the government, basically, under Trump with respect to climate change. There's going to be a lot of work, as there was last time, of organizations that just jump up, like We Are Still In and other organizations. The US Climate Alliance is an organization of, depending on how many governors are Democratic or if Republican, a little bit more moderate, then it's an organization of governors. Usually it's 24, 25, 26, whose states are active on climate and who continue acting. I think all of that kind of thing is very important. And I always used to, when I wasn't in the government anymore, but I was still going around the world talking with people and meeting with people in China and other places. And it was important for me to be able to say, the federal government, the government as controlled by Trump is not in the game, but there's large parts of the U.S. that are continuing to engage, and indeed, it's also true that I think that a tremendous amount of this spectacular progress that has been made on green technology, the sort of green revolution, that's not going to stop. Because if you sort of think about American car makers, if they suddenly say, well, we'll stop making electric vehicles because we don't have to under Trump, they're going to lose their ability to compete worldwide. I mean, Trump won't be there forever. So I think there's going to be a lot of the action that you see now will continue, in terms of developing those technologies and making new breakthroughs. But internationally, we will have no strong voice at all. We will have no real clout. We will have a few people who will be able to continue to be the climate people at the State Department, I imagine, but that's about what I would say.
Quick question here.
Quick question. So the logic of the Paris Agreement was very much the nationally determined contributions at the time wouldn't add up to what's necessary to meet, 1.5, but over time with the ambition cycle, the global stocktake, it would. Do you think, given the sort of the changes that have happened in geopolitics, the lack of trust, and other sort of developments, that this logic is actually playing itself out? And do you think it's going to play itself out sufficiently for us, if not to meet 1.5 tomorrow or the day after, eventually to actually meet the goals of the agreement? And I would say this particularly in the context of the fact that you referred to one phrase in the UAE consensus, but there was also another recital there which said we re-emphasize or reinforce the nationally determined nature of nationally determined contributions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think that not enough is happening. I don't actually look at that and say, therefore the Paris Agreement has failed. The Paris Agreement is in its core, it's based on a kind of mutual feedback between what countries do and what the Paris Agreement can do. And when when countries are more ambitious, Paris gets stronger. When Paris gets stronger, countries can be more ambitious. So both of these things can happen. If you just sort of look at the emission numbers now, if you look at the new report from UNEP, it's quite clear that we're not doing enough yet. I think that's one of the reasons why this next ratchet is going to be super important. Again, those are just promises. They're not like the actual fulfilled actions, but they're important. And so I think that's sort of where we are. If I could just sort of say one thing broadly, which relates to your question. As I look at the climate landscape right now, big picture, not down in the engine room. I think there are three big factors in the world today. One is that the science of climate change and the impacts of climate change are coming at us harder and faster than anybody realized, that the best scientists realized X years ago. They're just coming faster, and they are very dangerous. The second is that the technological revolution, the green revolution, has been absolutely spectacular. If you look at the last 10 years, we have somebody in the audience, Kingsmill Bond, who is one of the world's experts in this, and has all sorts of reports and graphs and charts that can show you what's happening. But basically, prices are all going like this, and the uptake of renewable energy, solar and wind and batteries and electric vehicles and heat pumps and on and on and on is fantastic, as is the kind of startup lab work being done to make green steel and green cement and all of the other areas where there's not good green stuff yet. So that's all spectacular. And if there wasn't a third piece in this, science, technology, if there was no third piece, you might look and say, maybe we have half a chance to get sort of close to net zero, sort of near 2050. But you also have the third factor, which is the obstacles. And the biggest obstacles are presented by the fossil fuel industry in terms of what they do and in terms of the influence that they have. And I think that the work that is being done that makes building a new solar plant and running it cheaper than anybody even just turning on a switch in the coal plant, that all is driving change, and electric vehicles are moving. All of that is happening in a great way, but I think there is another piece of this that is going to be essential. And that is that there's another piece of this that involves all of the aspects that I sometimes refer to as the human factor. So it's political will, and it's the clout of players like the fossil fuel industry. I think that you need more political will. The way that you get political will more effectively than any other is when politicians see that the public demands change in the direction that we do, and that's not there enough yet. There was a really important march in 2014 in New York. We had 400,000 people. That was great, but I hearken back to the original Earth Day in 1970, and this was the brainchild of a senator from Wisconsin named Gaylord Nelson, and he thought he could capitalize on the enormous activism of young people and people young at heart all over the United States. There was also a kind of rising environmental awareness. So he said that he wanted to have a teach-in, which is like a classic 60s word, and have a teach-in all over the country. 20 million people came out for that. 20 million people showed up. And in short order, within 2 years, you had the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, created, the Clean Air Act created, the Clean Water Act created, and a whole bunch of others later in that decade. Those first 3 really crucial ones were all done in the presidency of that famous liberal, Richard Nixon, right? Why did they do it? Because they saw that there was a demand, like really a demand from the public, and if they ignored it, they could suffer the consequences. And that, I think, we're not there yet, but that essentially, it sort of boils down to greatly increasing the normative power of what has to be done. And I think that's part of what has to be done.
So Todd, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I think for those of you who are students here or across the university, climate touches on everything now, right? So it goes to the fundamental effectiveness of our democratic processes and discussions, and how that signal and noise from people who want clean air, people who want clean water, people who want some sense that prosperity is possible, people who want justice. So how well do our democratic systems reflect that signal and noise to the sort of deep science base across the university, to the Oxford Net Zero amazing grouping of academics who are working on all aspects of what this means, and to finance and where we find the means to pay for this. So you will come across climate, and you will come across what it takes to reach international agreement, and that protected sort of working space of climate negotiations, which is one of the areas where multilateralism is still working, even if it's limping along at some time. And you'll also come across what it means to be a leader, right? What it means to lead in the international context as a negotiator, or as the minister who interprets in the real moment that actually leadership means that I'm going to go and step into that room or not step into that room, as Isabella Teixeira did in Paris, or as others have done over the negotiations of the year. So what does it take to have leaders like that at whatever level in negotiations like that? And then what does it mean when we come back home? And what does it mean in this era of implementation? What does it mean to take these agreements and put them into a way that can be understood by the public so that they would support action? And I think that's fundamental, because here we focus on the how as well as the what, right? How does government govern? How do we take hard-fought agreements like this and turn it into things that make sense for the public, that will return you to office, keep your budget and balance of payments in some kind of shape that the IMF would approve of and the public would approve of, and are right-sized in their ambition, right? So this is the triangle of where governments have to land, right? It has to be ambitious, has to be manageable from a budgetary point of view, and it has to see you return to office if you're a politician. So, Todd, thank you very much for spending this time with us. And lots of food for thought, lots of great questions already, lots of future work, and hopefully a new generation of solutions coming out of these kinds of sessions.
I would only say thank you to you. Everybody here should know that Rachel is really one of the great intellectual and in all other ways leaders on climate around the world, and you're lucky if you can rub shoulders with her. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.